This project is about Venezuela's large-scale refugee crisis currently causing millions of Venezuelans to suffer every day.
Venezuela is located on the north end of South America. Its neighboring countries are Brazil, Colombia, and Guyana. The crisis in Venezuela has forced 6 million refugees to flee into neighboring countries. The crisis has put many people at risk: disabled people, elderly, children, and pregnant women in particular. People who leave Venezuela flee from extreme violence, food insecurity, and lack of medicine and essential services.
The height of the COVID-19 pandemic has worsened the refugee crisis and has decreased the amounts of necessities that were already at dangerous lows. Many are at risk for eviction and are in other dangerous positions. Venezuelans are very vulnerable to human traffickers and smugglers and fall prey to them when crossing the border. Up to December 2021, more than 6.05 million Venezuelans have fled.
The crisis was heightened because of a large conflict with the leaders of the country. Nicolas Maduro won a presidential election many people believe to be fraudulent, but Juan Guaido, who is the leader of the National Assembly, proclaimed himself president on January 23, 2019, using a constitutional provision to do so. While these efforts to recognize Guaido as the legitimate president are widespread, and as the United States and 50 other democratic nations recognize him as the rightful president, Maduro still heavily controls Venezuela and is backed by autocratic nations like China and Russia.
Maduro's Socialist Party has remained supreme, which is the cause, in the belief of many, for the refugee crisis. 50% of children under 5 show signs of malnutrition, and about 280,000 are currently at the risk of dying due to malnourishment. The fighting between Colombian and the Venezuelan armies have displaced many Venezuelans. Many Venezuelans have been forced out of their country into Colombia due to violence between Venezuelan armed forces and rebel groups. But the issues continue to intensify as Venezuela's government was recently accused by a human rights activist group to be working with the Colombian rebel groups due to the conflict between Venezuela and Colombia.
The first demographic we are looking at is children. The youngest refugees have to flee, leaving their school and learning behind. They have no idea when they can go back to school and get an education they're robbed of when escaping violence. For all of the kids who are migrating, their brains are still developing, and the war and starvation and many other factors may make it difficult for them to go back into society without being scared. They also face xenophobia, which could make them not want to go to school or get jobs as adults.
The second demographic we focused on is women. Venezuelan women are suffering especially during the crisis due to a lack of supplies they find essential. They are not treated with the respect they deserve and are particularly vulnerable because of this. Feminine products are extremely difficult to find. Women are excluded from political decisions that affect them and their well-being, including the distribution of their necessities. Women are also put in difficult positions to find work during this economic crisis. In 2020, Venezuela got a 0.71 on the Gender Gap Index, which means women are 29% less likely to have equal opportunities in schooling, work, and politics. Venezuela's score dropped 3 points since 2018. In 2020, the percent of female homicides, also known as femicides, increased by 50% from the year before, even though the country's population is decreasing. In 2021, 34 women were reportedly killed due to domestic violence. They also often fall prey to human traffickers at the borders and are exploited. Pregnant women are especially vulnerable to these traffickers.
The second to last demographic we're going to be looking at are the elderly people of Venezuela. A study conducted by Convoy found that 77% of older Venezuelans claimed they couldn't get enough food and were often malnourished. This is because most elderly people in Venezuela have worked low-income jobs their whole life and were unable to save for retirement, so they're forced to keep working just to stay afloat. But Venezuela having their hunger and prescription shortages, as well as a collapsing public health system, leaves a lot of elderly people with only one option, which is to join the 4.5 million Venezuelan refugees around the world. However, it is not easy for them to immigrate because of the health challenges that come with old age, so sadly a lot of them end up dying while fleeing. It's truly a tragedy, and at the moment there's no end in sight to this issue.
The final demographic we're going to look at are the young men. Just like all the other demographics, they are struggling but not always in the same way. From what we did learn, a lot of the young men get left to stay behind or to flee by themselves. The ones who stay are often harassed by guerrilla groups. When they are recruiting, guerrilla groups are groups that fight against the government. There are many organizations providing shelter and resources to help the men who do flee. The young men's journey and experiences are different from children and women's because they are usually alone, and the children and women usually flee together and stay and have shelter together. Lots of the young men coming into the neighboring countries were interviewed. What was discovered was that a lot more of them were educated compared to the elderly and the children and the women. The educated young men have been able to find skilled jobs, but those who didn't have the same education struggled to find work. In my opinion, the organization should focus on making a program to help refugees find work who are uneducated and unskilled. So much of the refugee experience varies depending on where you go and how you decide to get there, but men do usually go alone, and it's a hard journey.
In conclusion, we found that all Venezuelans are suffering because of the internal crisis, but we can help. There are many organizations we can donate to, like groups listed on the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees website. Also, as we are doing, we need to continue to raise awareness and build understanding about these issues, and we need to create empathy and attention for all of those refugees suffering around the world. This project was made by Ellis Lynch, Gianni Testa, Jameson and Blanchard. Thank you.